All right, let's take a look at populating the U.S. So this is Unit 3, and basically we'll be discussing immigration to the United States. Here are the review questions. You can go ahead and pause if you missed them and just write them down if you need. So let's really quick discuss manifest destiny. Manifest destiny is, the best way I can explain it is, let's say that you have a date and you're going to go pick up the girl and you're nervous about it and stuff like that. And you get out of your neighborhood and you get on the main road like Concord Boulevard or something like that. And you hit every green light. You hit 8 green lights all the way to her house when you usually hit, all of them are red or something like that. You may say that there is this sort of divine influence allowing you to pick up this girl, and it may put you in a mood to where you say, oh, this is destined to be, or something like that. I don't know how you teenagers think anymore, but that's the destiny part, and the manifest is something you see before you. So here's sort of a rendering of that manifest destiny. You can see in the direction that they're moving. They're moving east to west. And this is sort of the, angel of destiny or something like that. And you can see in her hand, she has telegraph cable. You have telegraph, you have trains coming out. First there were wagons, and then came the trains. And you have the gold miners. And they're setting up farms over here. And in the distance, there are ships for trade. And then look, the Native Americans right here, they're fleeing, which kind of shows you the racism of the time, and it's all dark and cloudy, and they're bringing the light to the darkness over here. But to say it's like manifest destiny, like hitting 8 green lights in a row, is kind of an oversimplification. It was actually quite difficult to move west, but they still saw it as as a whole. They still saw it as we're destined to have our country go shore to shore. So what does it take to have a country? So first we settled the East, and then we had the Louisiana Purchase, and then we had the Mexican-American War, 1850, and that gave us the Southwest. And then if you take a look at the map, so we started, immigration started in New York and slowly spread out west. Here are some major immigration points throughout the United States. So slowly but surely you can see that the red dot moves west, and as you can kind of think of it like centers of population density, where at first it was in the east, and then as we moved west, the center of the population moved west. So to have any country, you need borders. So you can see that we have borders. And then the red dots represent population. So another thing you need is population. So you need borders, population. You need a government. So that's that building right there with the pillars. And then sovereignty. So can that government building, or can the United States government repel foreign invaders? Like in the War of 1812, the British invaded the United States, and they almost won. They burnt down our capital, but we eventually wore them down and defeated the British, and they had to return home. So that upheld our sovereignty. Sovereignty is a fancy way of saying, can someone else screw with you? So let's take a look at settling in America. So the first off, you have westward expansion, so making a country. Again, you have population, borders, governments, and sovereignty. And again, sovereignty is, can people screw with you? So the first thing, so you have the original 13 colonies. The 14th state was Ohio. So we settled the Ohio territory, carved it up for farmers, and moved farmers on in there. Then you have the Homestead Act. We already talked about that. That was 1862. And we pushed farmers further west towards Nebraska and Kansas and those areas in there where you can farm. This caused a displacement of natives, which, we'd battle it out. You'd have Native Americans attack settlers. You'd have settlers attack Native Americans. But all of that ended in 1893. We moved them onto reservations, and we moved them. One reservation was in South Dakota. And then you have the battle or the massacre at Wounded Knee, where a bunch of soldiers shot up innocent women and children in 1893 at Wounded Knee, and they all died. And that was pretty much the end of Native Americans trying to, form any sort of attack on the United States. You had the Morrill Act, which taught homesteaders how to farm. So, you may have someone move west, but that doesn't necessarily mean they know how to plant stuff. So the Morrill Act educated these new farmers on how to farm. And then cowboys, they went, you grew cows. We talked about this a bit. You grew cows in Texas, and then they moved north. They would drive cattle through Kansas. The cows would get sent by train to Chicago, New York. They'd be carved up for meat. If you watch any cowboy movies, from the 50s and 60s, it's a little racist in the movies because African Americans comprised, say, 40% of all cowboys. So, these former slaves, their kids grew up, and being a cowboy was a pretty good economic activity. So, yeah, they became cowboys. So 1800s immigration. So the Irish and German immigration started 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, and lasted until, say, the 1880s, 1890s. So the Irish, so get this working. There we go. So the Irish in the 1840s, they fled the potato famine, and what the potato famine was is basically Britain. Potatoes are not native to Ireland, and you make whiskey out of potatoes. And so the British used Ireland as a place to grow these potatoes. The environment was just good for growing potatoes. The problem is they overplanted the potatoes because they were only in the money they made they used it as a cash crop. So instead of using the food you grew for eating, they used it for making whiskey. Now, that's not to say there weren't extra potatoes, to eat and stuff like that. So the Irish kind of became known as potato eaters. It was a derogatory term to call the Irish. Well, if you plant the same plant in the same soil year after year after year, you wear out the soil. All the nutrients that go into making the potatoes from the soil disappears, and you can't really grow potatoes anymore. Also, you have what you call invasive species, so fungus or insects that come into an area because they just get used to the environment. So a fungus will show up and be like, oh, potatoes again. All right, cool. And then the next year, fungus shows up. Oh, wow, I can spread even farther. So the big one was basically these potato crops became infected by fungus, and they were all tore up and gone. The Irish started starving. So the one outlet they had was the United States. So you had the Irish coming over, starving to death, and the ships they were coming over on were called coffin ships, or not all of them, but they were nicknamed coffin ships because of how many dead would arrive, or how many died on the way, and then they'd arrive, and then they'd have to bring off the dead. It was pretty dark thing. And then you have the Germans in the 1840s as well, 1840s, 1850s. And the Germans left for sort of a variety of reasons. One was the promise of wealth. So the Irish really only left because of the potato famine. They were leaving because they were starving. The Germans, there was a promise of wealth, and in their country there was also religious persecution against the Catholics. So if you were a Catholic German, you were persecuted. Germany wanted everyone to be Protestant. And he had a very authoritarian government. They wanted, taxes and stuff like that. It was mostly farmers, German farmers who came over. Germany wanted to take farmers out of the farms and put them in cities to industrialize. And then there was the demand of military service. So you had a lot of Germans who just didn't want to join the military. So they had the option. They were rich enough, so they fled. They just left. Now, it's not like they would maybe sell everything they owned and came over and had a little bit of money left. When the Irish came over, they were flat broke and starving. So discussing push-pull factors. So what pushes people out of Europe to the United States, and what about the United States pulls them over? So push factors would be overpopulation within Europe. You had agricultural issues, so you had short-lived famines, and also the potato famine. Germany didn't have too many famines, but sometimes prices would fluctuate, like we talked about with industrialization, religious persecution, pull factors, freedom, or at least from their perspective, freedom, economic opportunity, and plentiful land. Now, for the Germans, they were able to take great advantage of this, and a lot of Germans came over already educated. The Irish didn't know how to farm or farm well, or they only knew how to farm potatoes, which is pretty easy. But the German farmers, they had their own land. They knew how to tend after acres and acres of land. So they came over pretty educated, knew how to read, things like that, which is pretty helpful. So for the Germans, they realized the freedom and economic opportunity and the plentiful land. Whereas the Irish kind of got stuck in the cities, mainly New York and Boston. They couldn't move west like the Germans could. So, we'll talk about what that meant. So here's New York City today. So you come in as a immigrant and you pass through and you see, this was 1880, 1890. You would see the Statue of Liberty, and that was sort of a sign that everything was going to be okay. But oftentimes there's a phrase, out of the frying pan into the fryer, where you think that your conditions are miserable, so you make a change, and then you end up being just as, if not more, miserable. And you can see how old this picture is. It's at least 18 years old as of this video. So these are Italian immigrants just coming off the boat. They put little tags on them, and they're just bringing anything they packed up. So the Italians came over 1890s, 1900s, and they kind of pushed them through like cattle. This is Ellis Island, but this picture is 1880s, 1890s. You can kind of tell by the quality of the picture. So they had these sort of cattle gates and stuff like that. They didn't know how to handle the whole influx. So yeah, they treated them like cattle. And you can see little tags that tells them their name, where they're from, and the address that they lived in Europe. And that's what's cool about Ellis Island. If you did have family who came over from Europe, from like Italy or Eastern Europe or something like that, you can literally go back to the country they came from and look up their home address. It's actually kind of cool. And they also changed names. So like Polish names are notoriously hard. So sometimes you'd get a immigration official, a U.S. immigration official. You ask them your name, and then they try to say it, and the immigration official will just be like, "I'm not spelling that," and basically they changed your name. And apparently with Clayson they did that. I think it was they just dropped a ton of consonants and vowels. I don't know. It's like Clausen, Clausen. And they're like, no, we're not going to play that game. So I guess that's how it was changed to Clayson. These are Eastern European immigrants. Eastern European immigrants found a lot of discrimination when they came over at the time. There was trouble going on they were fleeing like trouble. And the United States took it as, here's these invaders bringing trouble with them. So Eastern Europeans sort of found some discrimination. All immigrant groups found discrimination, and I'll talk about that in class. Oops. There we are. So with the Chinese and Japanese, some immigrants came from Asia, a small percentage, and I'll show you some pie charts. 1851, 1883, 200,000 Chinese immigrants, and they mostly built the railroads. They came through Angel Island. You can visit that. It's just right over in San Francisco. We were considered a melting pot, and I remember learning that in school, where you come over as an immigrant and you shed your culture and then become American. And that isn't what they teach kids anymore. They teach it multiculturalism, where you can keep your culture and everyone's accepting of everyone else's culture. In some ways that remains to be seen, but all the same. Maybe in the Bay Area, but there's a lot of parts of the country where that's just not true. Well, even in like Fresno and stuff like that, there's been some violence against people of different cultures. So you have the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1883, and basically when the railroad was pretty much done being built, but Chinese people kept coming over. There was no reason to have them as labor, so they started excluding them. The Chinese immigrants that were left were only allowed to do certain things. They could open a restaurant, and that's where you get Chinese food. They lived in segregated areas, so that's why you have Chinatown in San Francisco. And they were able to do laundry and things like that. You did have some Chinese butchers, things like that, but that was mainly just to feed or to give products over to the Chinese restaurants. So like an egg roll, if you go to China, they don't have fried egg rolls. That's a Chinese thing, or an American Chinese thing. Another fun one is chop suey. I love this. So if you go and eat at a Chinese restaurant, back then you may not finish everything on your plate. So, you don't want to waste food. So what they do is they'd scrape the plates off into a boiling pot, and that pot would boil. And then when dinner came around, they'd serve it back to them. It's pretty good. So you have the Chinese Exclusion Act, and then you have the Japanese coming over. The Japanese were farmers, but they were crowding out, or sort of, there's only so much land. So either someone who's Japanese is going to own it, or someone who's white is going to own it. And the Japanese were limiting white people's opportunity to get farmland. And we got that, sadly, we got that farmland back during World War II, or at least white people did. Got that farmland back during World War II when we locked up all the Japanese in internment camps. And the Japanese had to sell off their land, so they sold it over to white farmers and never got their land back. So, hey, we got that land back. Kind of nice. I'm being sarcastic. And European immigration was pretty much left unchecked on the East Coast because they were a steady supply of cheap labor. So, hey, let's have some cheap labor.